Today I will be teaching you in this tutorial how to create your first ASP.NET MVC 5 web app. You first will click on the Visual Studio icon. Hopefully you have it saved on your taskbar. Then you click on File, New, Project. Make sure you select Visual C Sharp, Web, and make sure that ASP.NET Web Application selected. Under Name, you give it a name. Just going to call it First App. Make sure that Create Directory for Solutions selected. Make sure Application Inside is selected. You click OK. Right here you have two options. You can either select ASP.NET 4.5.2 or ASP.NET 5 templates. We are using ASP.NET 5 templates. In this tutorial we'll be selecting an empty project, but for future projects we will be using web application, and in other cases a web API. But for now we're going to use empty. Make sure host in the cloud is unselected. An empty application does not have authentication, but if you select on web application, it gives you that option, which you can do non-authentication, individual user accounts. This would mean a local database. If you did work and school accounts, that would allow you to sign in on the Azure cloud. And if you did Windows authentication, that would mean that you would be able to use Active Directory. But in this tutorial we will be using an empty solution which does not include authentication. You click on OK, wait for the project to be created. Okay, once you create your first application, Microsoft has provided a built-in README that gives you links to other resources where you could find more information on how to create an application. In our case, we really don't need it, so I'm just going to right click and delete. Say OK. Close it. And the next thing we need to do is to look at all the files that an empty application provides. This is a minimal files that you need for the application to run. If I click on IIS Run Application, you will notice that it's only going to show Hello World. The reason for that is because if we look at the startup config, which is the file that specifies what's going to run at the bottom, this is the entry point for your application. This whole file is the entry point of your application, and right here we're running await context response.write async hello world. This line is used to just says that no matter what, just show hello world. But we're going to be changing that in our application. So the first thing that we need to do is kind of go over all the files in an empty application. You notice we have the project.json. This file is used to define the .NET execution environment, which is a DNX. And in this case we're using DNX 4.5 and DNX Core 5. The difference between these two environments is that DNX 4.5 includes everything that .NET Framework provides, and this only runs on Windows. The .NET Core is more of a slimmed down version of .NET 4.5 and is multi-platform, meaning you can run it on Windows, Linux, and the Mac system. So it depends on what it is you want to use your application for. In most cases, the DNX provides more functionality, but at the same time it's not as fast and doesn't provide that cross-platform capability. Next file that we're going to look at is the global.json. And the global.json is up here. And this file pretty much is used to configure the project. It says it defines your source and test locations and what SDK version you're using. In our application, we're using RC1 Update 1. This is the latest version from Microsoft at the time of this tutorial. And then you have your startup.cs. This file is pretty much the entry point for your application. And when your web server starts, this is the file that is read first, and then after that it routes everything within your application. So now that I've given a breakdown of this, of an empty ASP.NET application, I'll be able to go into the steps to create this very minimal application. So the next step we need to do is to discuss the references in this application. Just like I said previously, we have your DNX environments, the 4.5.1 and the 5.0. In the empty application, you'll only see two dependencies: the IIS platform handler and the server Kestrel. These files is what ASP.NET uses to run your application, and it's a very fast web server application that allows you to run your web app, and it runs under the Kestrel environment, which is really fast and has a lot of improvements. And if I look at the DNX Core 5, it has the same files. Now the difference between the DNX Core and the 4.5, I said that the 5.0 was more of a slimmed down version, and if you see, I have assemblies that are unique to Windows environment, and if you look at that, that would be the Microsoft C# references, as well as the MS Core Lib, the system, and the system.core. These do not and will not run on Linux or Mac. These are dependent on the Windows environment. So this is why you see these on the 4.5, which is the version that only runs on Windows. And this is why you don't see it on the DNX Core 5 version, because that's cross-platform and can be run on Linux and a Mac. So now that we got that out of the way, let's discuss how to build the files to create our app. We will start with our startup config, which is the entry point of our application. But before we do that, we need to add some references to use the MVC framework. Right now, we're not using the MVC framework because the system and the application is not aware of that MVC even exists. So in order for us to allow our application to be aware of these MVC framework and to import it into our application, we need to go to our project.json. Under our project.json, we have this dependencies file. And right here, we add everything our application is going to use. And in our case, we're going to be using Microsoft. And here's the nice thing about Visual Studio. It gives you IntelliSense. So what is IntelliSense? IntelliSense is a feature in Visual Studio that allows you to type, and Visual Studio will give you feedback. So right here, I know that I want Microsoft dot, and I want ASP.NET. And now I can just press on the M, and it'll allow me to choose what it is I want. And in this case, I want MVC. Now that I know I want MVC, what version? We want the 600 RC1 final. And now once I notice on the right hand side under references, you will notice how I only have two dependencies. Once I click save, the system's going to be downloading. You see it's restoring the package, and now I have 3. So it's downloading those packages, and now I have my Nugget package right here. And it added it for both environments, 4.5.1 and 5.0. So now our system's aware, and it knows about MVC. So now we could use all the functionality within the MVC framework, which includes controllers, views, and models. So now that we got that out of the way, let's go back to our startup.ts, and in the startup.cs, we're going to go ahead and add the middleware into the startup to tell our application to use MVC. We're going to use the configure services. This is where you add all the services that your application is going to use. and all you need to do is type a line, and in that line you're gonna type services, and see how the system knows down here about my services. How does it know? Because I have a services up here, so it's aware of that, because this services is this variable right here. I'm gonna say dot, and lovely IntelliSense kicks in, and I'm gonna say I want to add, click add, and I want to add MVC, and they knew about it. And so now that I have that, the system is aware of MVC, but this just adds it. Now I need to tell the system to use it. So in order for me to tell the system to use MVC, I have to go into my configure. Everything that I have in here is what the system's going to use. So right now it's currently using this app.run, and this app variable is what I'm sending to the configure method in app, and that's why the system knows that this and these two are linked. But we're no longer using this app.run because we don't want it to just show hello world for everything that we pass in the URL. So we're going to change that and tell it to use MVC. And we do that by writing a couple of lines of code, which is app.use MVC. You see how it knows about use MVC? IntelliSense is kicking in. I want to pass this variable, and I want it to be knows about my map route. I want it to have a name. What name do I want? Default. These are just standards that I'm using. This will always be the same for MVC unless you're doing some custom routing, but this is the basic routing. So I'm just pretty much telling the system the format that I want for my routing. Last one's my default. And I'm just new. Right here I'm telling it what controller do I want it to use when I start my application. I want to use my home controller. And what action within my home controller do I want it to use? This index. Here I forgot to open my brackets and close my brackets down here. Okay, now that I have that, I'm gonna check. It's good practice to check once you type code if you have any build errors. And when you have a build error, that pretty much means that your system, the Visual Studio, your code has some type of error. So you click up here under build solution, and then on the lower left you see that it says build succeeded. If I would have had any errors, for example, if I delete the semicolon over here and I save my project, the system's telling me there's something right here, something's not right. Now let's say I overlooked that and I didn't see it. Let's say it was a bunch of code and I didn't see it. If I go up here and click on build solution, the system's gonna tell me there's an error, and then I can double click on here and it'll tell me exactly where the error is, and there it is. It took me, but I know that I need a semicolon. Save my project, I'll build it again, and the build succeeded. So now that I know my code is working fine, I move to the next step. So pretty much we just build our application right now to use MVC. If we were to choose the web application that Microsoft provides, the template that they provide, they do all this for you, and they add other stuff. They add logging, error handling. Right now we're going from scratch and we're building it ourselves. And this is why we're having to do this, but in the production application you'd probably use, and it's best practice to use what Microsoft has provided. But it's good for you to understand what all this means, and that way if you do need to troubleshoot, you're familiar with the startup.ts file and you don't feel intimidated. So now that we're comfortable with our startup.ts, we got to start building our MVC files. And what we need to do now is go under our first app. This is our application right here. This is our solution. Uh, your solution can have multiple projects. We only have one project within our solution. And this is my project right here. So I'm gonna add 3 folders to my solution. I'm gonna add my controllers, I will add, and if you notice on my menu I have new item, existing item, new empty file. You might not see the new empty file because this is a custom setup that I have, and you would need to download a NuGet package that allows you to do that. But if you're interested, I can show you how to do that in another tutorial. And then we need to build our models, and the last file is our views. This is why this is called MVC framework, because it uses the models, views, controllers framework. So we always start with our models, and our models pretty much hold our data structure. And so what we need to do now is create a class. We're going to create a class. I'm going to say new item, and if you see under new item, make sure you have server side. And you have options: a controller class, a view page, but we just want the class. And then that class, we're going to call this employee. The app we're creating is just something very basic that's just going to store employee information and show it on the web browser using the MVC framework. So we call this employee.cs. We click on add. The system, anytime you create a class, will create the structure for you, the namespace, the name of your class. And what we want to do here is define our employee. Our employee is an object. This is an object-oriented programming language, and we need to define what an employee consists of. In this tutorial, we'll just be using 4 unique attributes to an employee, which is their ID, their name, their salary, and their email address. So there's a neat little function with the Visual Studio where you just type prop. It stands for property. You press tab, and it allows you to define your property. In this, my ID is going to be an integer, so I leave it as an int. I'm going to call it ID. I'm going to create a second property. This is going to be a string. I'm going to call this name. And then I'm going to create my third property. It's going to be an integer again, and it's going to be my salary. And then my last property, which is going to be my email address, which is going to be a string. I'm just going to call this email. Now that I define all my properties within my model class, I'm done. I can just save this, and we're done with our model class. Notice what the namespace is. It's firstapp.models. If I look to my right, here's my solution. Within my solution, my project's called First App, and then within First App, I have models, and then employee CS. So this is First App models employee CS, which is this file employee CS. Up here's the title of our file. So the next thing I want to do is go into our controllers. Once we've defined our models and the properties of our object, I want to create my controller. I do the same process, right click, add, new item, MVC controller class. And I'm gonna let Visual Studio use the default name, which is home controller, which is what we actually defined. Click OK, and I'm gonna allow it to create home controller. We defined this on our startup.cs. If you notice, I have here controller, and the controller equals to home. This is the reason why this is called right here home controller. So the system automatically knows that anything before controller is the name of your controller, and in this case is home. And this is just a basic class that Microsoft creates for you. It already imported ASP.NET MVC. But in order for our system to know about our employee class, we need to import it. But before I do that, let me show you something. I'm going to create an employee right now. I'm going to say employee, which is type employee. The object we just created, it's a type employee, and I'm going to say employee equals new. But notice how I have squiggly lines here. The system's like, say, wait a minute, I don't know a type employee. But this Visual Studio gives you suggestion. This little light bulb says, oh, I think I know what it is. So then you just right click and you say, and it's telling you, well, why don't you import using first models or models employee? And right here it's saying that I should bring in this namespace. And if I bring this namespace, see, it knows about employee. What it's doing, it's bringing in my employees class, and this is an employee, so it knows that I have an employee object. This class right here is just an employee object. I created a class that created an employee object, and that's the reason why I'm able to, once I import this, to be able to use it here. And now my employee is happy. And if I click on here and I right click and I say go to definition, it goes back to employee, because that's where it's pulling it from. That's the definition of the employee. Anytime you want to see anything of how where it comes from or where it's being derived from, you can just right click on this iAction result, for example, and say go to definition. This will show you what class is using Microsoft.asp.mvc iAction result. If I were to remove this on my application, if I remove this line over here and I say, you know what, I don't want to use MVC, and I remove that, the system is going to say, wait, I don't know what iAction result is. The same thing. I have to import it in order to use it. I import it, the system's happy now. So now that I have my class, all I need to do is define my employee. What does my employee consist of? It consists of, we're going to start with the name. So we're just going to start with ID. Seeing how the system's giving me the IntelliSense to say, no, I know this employee has properties that consist of ID, email, and name. So I'm going to say ID. I know that it's an integer, so I'm just going to say my ID is 101. And I'm going to say my email, my name. I know it's a string, so I'm going to say it's Gus. And notice how the system knows that I've been using other properties, so I don't need it doesn't give me as an option because I've already defined them. And my salary is an integer, so I'm going to say I make 100,000, right? Nice number. And then my email, I know it's a string, so I'm going to say gmorales@celeron.us. And I just close it with a semicolon, and my code is happy. Even though I've defined this, I have to return the employee in my view, because then if I don't do this, the view is not going to be aware of employee. So I can save this, and we build, cross our fingers, hope everything succeeds. Build succeeded, and that means everything's happy. Visual Studio's happy, so I can move on to the next step. The last thing we need to do is to create our view. But in our views, we need to add another folder. And I'll hold off on that. Let's not create it. Let's just create our class. We're just going to create our class, and I'm going to call this class. Right here, I'm going to select MVC view page, which is what I need. And I'm going to leave the defaults index, because if I go back to my startup CS, my action is index. So the system knows to go right here to index. So those two are the same files. If I click on index, so now I'm gonna import my model at model, and I'm gonna say so I'm gonna import my model, and my model is saved under employees. So I have to say first tab dot model dot employee. So then that just brings in all my data from here. It brings in all this model information, which is all the properties, in order to use it. And so this is where I use some basic HTML. I'm using an H2 tag. I'm just gonna say employee details. Nothing fancy here. It's just an H2 tag. Now I'm gonna create a table, and then in the table I'm gonna create a row, a column, call it ID. This is just formatting, and this is where I'm pulling my data, where I say at model dot, and it's gonna tell me, well, what do you want to bring in? Well, we want our ID. I'm gonna make another row, and then a column, and I'm gonna title this name, and my column, I'm gonna display the information. I'm gonna say add model dot name. I love this IntelliSense. It just saves you from typing, and it helps out a lot. If I were using Visual Code on the Mac, I wouldn't be getting this IntelliSense. I want my salary. And then on my salary, I'm just gonna put at model. You see how it becomes repetitive at times? Salary, and we just have one more. TD and email. At model dot email. And that's it. So we just save this. We do a build. Our build succeeded, and we run our application. Cross our fingers and hope this worked. If this worked, I should see a table with employee information. But wait, it's a white blank page. If I say inspect, I have a 404 status not found, and an internal 500. What's happening here? It's the system's going to our startup page, and it's going to home index, and it goes to home index controller, and it goes to the home controller index, and it's asking to return the view under views home index. But if I go to views, I don't have a home folder, so the system's complaining. I need to add a folder named home that matches our controller. So if I say home now, and I did this on purpose so you can see, and I put it in here, and now that my index, there's a view that says home index, like controller's home index. Now that matches, if I save my project, build for solutions, and I run it again, it should show me what I'm looking for now. And there you go, employee details, ID 101. So it's something basic, nothing fancy. This tutorial was just to illustrate how all the parts come together, a little bit more of an understanding of what this all means. There's not a lot of files here. It's very basic, easy to grasp. Your controllers, your models, and your views. And although we're just showing 4 properties on the web page, it really does show you how MVC works, how it all ties in, And this is the first tutorial of many to come, and this is the foundation. And I'll be doing another tutorial after this. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed the tutorial.